Hi, I finally got to the story I've been real excited to tell you. But before I could tell you the story, I need to remind you of a couple things. The one thing I want to remind you is when I began telling the stories, I told you that God wanted us to have the Bible because it teaches us about Him and how to know Him. He wants us to know about Him. So this is one of those stories that will kind of help us understand God just a little more. So God said then that we were made in His image. The Bible story that I'm about to tell you will use Abraham to teach us how we are like God, or how God feels about families. Two other things I need to explain to you as well. First, God in all the Bible never allowed or approved of His people offering Him human sacrifices. So when God talks about human sacrifices with Abraham, we must see why He even talks about it. There's a reason. And the second thing I want to talk about, or remind you, is that the pictures that I use to illustrate these Bible stories come from other people's imaginations and famous paintings, which is their imagination, because no one has ever seen the people in the Bible. There was no pictures in the Bible when it was written. And I hope you can see the story happening through the words, but the pictures helps our imaginations work a little better. But in this story, the reason I'm telling you is because in this story, the pictures I have shows Isaac as a little boy. And I don't think Isaac was a little boy. In fact, he was almost grown up, but he was still called a lad. So he wasn't quite finished growing up. But here is the story I want to tell you. Abraham began teaching his son Isaac when he reached his 12th birthday. And he taught him how to run their farm and how to care for their animals. But most of all, Abraham taught Isaac how to love God. Yes, he, like all of us, must learn to love God. They made their offering of worship together. They picked out the perfect young lamb or sheep when it was time to kill and offer as a burnt offering. When they burnt the sheep, the smoke went up to God like an incense. And that was the way God had instructed them to do it. So now, this worship continued for many years until Isaac was nearly grown. But he was still called a lad. It was time again to offer their sacrifice, the perfect sheep. And I think they may have done this once a year, but I'm not sure about that. That's the way it was done later, for sure. God sent a messenger to Abraham this particular year, and he told him how he must worship God this time. Abraham should offer his own son, Isaac, in place of a sheep. Abraham had always followed everything that God had told him to do, but this was different. It was more difficult than anything he could think of. It was a test to test Abraham. Abraham had to figure out this, and Abraham remembered how long he had waited for his promised son, and knew that God had told him that Isaac would be the father of a great nation, and he would be the blessing to a great nation, and he would be the blessing to all nations. So Abraham thought to himself that God could and would bring Isaac back to life if he were to die. So Abraham trusted God, and because God had always keeps his promises. And the New Testament, there's a verse about Abraham, and it tells us that that's exactly what Abraham thought, that if Isaac were to die, he would bring him back to life. Well, when the day came for Abraham, picked two of his servants and a donkey to carry the bundle of firewood, and Abraham carried a container of burning coal or fire and a knife. They traveled 3 days to get to Mount Moriah. They left the servants behind, and probably at a camp. When you go 3 days, you have to have a camp. So they left the servants behind, and Abraham and Isaac went upward to where God had told Abraham to go for the sacrifice. And this place is called Mount Moriah. And many years later became the place where all sacrifices and worship took place. And we'll hear more about where that is later in other stories. So as they walked up the mount, Isaac asked Abraham a question. "My father, we have the fire and we have the wood." He knew because he was carrying the wood. "But we have no lamb." And Abraham replied, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." And they kept going to the place. When they got to the right place, Abraham built an altar and put the wood on it. Next, he tied Isaac's hands and had him lay on the altar. Now this is where I have difficulty answering some of my questions. Like, did Isaac figure it out, or did he ask his father questions? I don't know, but he did not disobey his father. And it is difficult to know the answers to the questions we might have, because the Bible doesn't explain everything to us. But it does tell us what happened next. Abraham raised the knife over Isaac to kill him, just as he had done with all the lambs that he had offered in the years before. And my imagination tells me that he was shaking and crying because he loved his son more than anything else except God. But before he could bring the knife down into Isaac, an angel of God spoke from heaven and told him to stop, for he had shown that he loved God more than anything and anyone else. And then Abraham saw that God had put a sheep over in the tangled bushes nearby, and Abraham caught the sheep and finished his sacrifice with this sheep. Well, this story may be the most important story in the Old Testament, because it showed Abraham the future. You see, God was going to offer his own son as an offering many, many years later. Abraham got to see the future by feeling what God must be feeling in offering his own son, Jesus. We can begin to understand just a tiny part of God by understanding the story of Abraham and his son, Isaac. It is a story of true love for God.